Great Peninsula, collect mushrooms, bring them back to the Red Barn, identify them, kind of get the prettiest, best looking ones, and then gather those for our display the next day at the Bear Valley Visitor Center. We have all sorts of interesting displays to educate you about fungi. We're going to have the San Francisco Microscopical Society have a table again, and they're just wonderful, and they bring in all these fancy microscopes, and you can bring mushrooms to them and they'll put them under the scope and show you neat features. We're going to have talks this year in the auditorium. We're being a little braver about COVID. And then we have mushroom displays out back. And again, this is a free event, and it runs from 10 to 4 on Sunday, the first weekend in January. Then we also have another free event at the Sycamore Grove in Livermore, and that is on the Sunday of Martin Luther King weekend. And that's again where people just gather. We all go out across the park, we collect mushrooms, we bring them back, identify them, and talk about them. So it's another fun community event. And that's all we've got for the next couple of months, but who knows what we'll come up with beyond that. And now we come to our speaker. Dr. Todd Elliott. I have known Todd since he was 14 years old, and he was my lab partner at an intensive mycological workshop in Georgia at a place called
North Carolina.
Yeah.
Oh, North Carolina?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what do I know? It's on the south, it's all the same. Yeah. At Highlands, and he was my lab partner, and we just got along like a house of fire. So we have been friends all these years. He, was just a kid, but then he went to college, and then he went off to Australia and got his PhD, and he's been doing lots and lots of interesting research on animal and fungi interactions. He's also a truffle specialist, and believe it or not, in his youthful age of 31, he has published 100 species of fungus. So he's a real go-getter, a good personal friend of mine. Please welcome Todd Elliott.
Thank y'all. How y'all doing this evening?
Good.
Let's see here. Is that making it easier to see the screen? Should we go all the way?
Yeah.
All the way? All right. Then keep you all in the dark. Makes it easier to doze off, So, how's everybody doing?
All right.
Good. Well, I'm so excited to be here. Great to be among a bunch of fungal kindred spirits. And so I see some of you all are this might be your first meeting, and so I'm going to do a really quick sort of high-speed run-through on a little bit of basic fungal biology. For those of you that are already familiar with it, you can take a quick doze or jump in and correct me where I'm off. But just so that we all have a sort of common language to understand how fungi function in ecosystems, and then when we do a deep dive into these fungal interactions. So when you're out there picking a mushroom in the woods, also I'll say if there's anything you have questions, please interrupt. I love tangents, I love input, I love exciting other comments, so don't be bashful. So when you're finding a mushroom in the woods, you're actually finding the fruiting body. It's the apple off an apple tree. Most of the organism is in the soil, it's in a rotting log, it's in any given sort of substrate. It might be only inside of an insect. They have all different ways that they function in the ecosystem. But most of a mushroom is made up of these fine filaments. They're called mycelia, or hyphae if it's a single strand, and they're spreading out through the environment, and they're doing all sorts of different things. And they, in many cases, form very beneficial interactions with plants. They help plants with nutrient uptake. In exchange, the plants help the fungi by giving them sugars. This is called mycorrhizae. Myco meaning fungus, rhizae meaning root, literally means fungus root. So that's sort of the basis of what's happening with a lot of those mushrooms. But how do they get out into the environment? So this cool little mushroom, this is a mycena. Anybody want to guess what color spore it has?
Rust.
There's a hint right down here.
Ooh, white.
All right, so this is a white spore print. So this is a spore print that happened in the environment. Look at all these spores that have been deposited back on this stick. And this mushroom is at peak maturity, a little past. You can see a couple of them are getting older here. Now, with mycenas, they're actually forcibly discharging these spores. And who's ever made a spore print? All right, so if you made a spore print, you were probably having looked at the underside of the mushroom, and you might be looking if it has gills, pores, or teeth. These are 3 of the most common ways, but mushrooms love to make all sorts of different types of fruiting bodies. But the reason I'm touching on this is it'll become relevant as we get a little further into this talk. But so what actually happens is there's these gills, and let's just use a gilled mushroom for example. They've got gills that radiate out like spokes from a wheel. If you're a mycologist, you might call those lamellae, or these short ones, you might call them lamellulae. And what happens is those gills radiate out, and on the end of those gills, imagine a baseball bat. And in the end of the baseball bat, imagine a couple little nails sticking off. And on the end of those nails, imagine the little round spores. Now, those spores, y'all might be getting tired of listening to me yak. Take a deep breath. A few of you might be wearing masks, so you're in a good situation, but most of us have breathed in hundreds, if not thousands, of fungal spores, because they're all in the environment, all around us all the time. But what's really fascinating to think about is how the spores get out in the environment. So in the case of these, where these are called basidiomycetes because they produce those spores, those baseball bats are called basidia. And on the end of them, those little spores, they build up pressure, they build up pressure, they build up pressure, and then they explode off of the basidia. And then they bounce back and forth between the gills because the spore and the gill has different electric charges, and they bang, 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 they bounce out. Now, the crazy thing is, who's driven a car too fast? All right, how about any of you been on like a really high-speed roller coaster? All right, so you might have been exposed to a G-force of like 3 or 4. That's the momentum throwing you forward. But the G-force of a fungal spore leaving its gill, I haven't done the estimates myself, but those that have done it claim it's close to 10,000. One of the greatest G-forces that's known. And if you think about it, that's happening on your kitchen table when you're making a spore print. Wow, right? Boom, 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 these little explosions happening. Now the cool thing is ideally, the mushroom has a cap that's sort of shaped like an airplane wing, so you get a current off the top of that and it pulls the spore off and it might end up in the stratosphere. Spores move widely through the landscape. But the crazy thing is, 80–90% of the spores land within sort of 6-ish feet of the parent mushroom, roughly there. So most of the spores aren't actually getting out in the environment. So if you're out there harvesting mushrooms that are mature, you're picking those boletes and those chanterelles when they're fully ready to spore, and you're carrying them in an open bag, you're actually helping with dispersal. You're moving them through the landscape. And that's a lot of what we'll talk about today is some of the mechanisms and some of the associations between fungi and animals. But I wanted to give you a little bit of that basics of what's happening when spores get out in the environment. So, when they get out in the environment, this is a relatively simplified explanation, but who's ever seen a fairy ring? All right. So what's actually happening is mushrooms like to grow out in a circle, and if they have a good flat environment, you'll see this sort of outward motion as they grow. And you can actually roughly estimate the age. If you mark them every year, you can sort of say, oh, that fairy ring might be X number of years old. I have a friend who some of you probably know is a mycologist in Wyoming and named Steve Miller, and he loves to work, he's a pilot, and he loves to do mycology, and it's really hard to meld those two things. And so he started doing some estimates on fairy rings, and because he could look at them from his plane. And he started realizing some of them were several hundred years old because he could age how far they were. And because the rings were so big, on the ground he couldn't detect the curve. So you might find one mushroom and one mushroom further